So tonight, I actually want to talk about the big lie that every politician tells you. And that lie is really very simple. That lie is the government can fix your problems. Okay, this is a lie. The government cannot fix your problems. Now, first, a caveat. There are cases in which the government is necessary. I'm not an anarchist. Conservatives are not anarchists. The government is necessary, according to the American Founding Fathers, to protect three things: life, liberty, property. Those are the three things. The government is necessary in order to protect life, because there are certain people who are not strong enough to protect their own lives, and so we delegate out that authority to a neutral arbiter, namely the government, in order to protect everybody's life. Liberty, the government exists to protect existing God-given rights that pre-exist government. This is the Lockean bargain. And we in the conservative movement are not believers that rights spring from government itself, that the government creates rights out of nothing and then hands those rights to you because the government is benevolent and kind. We don't believe any of that. We believe that you, in a state of nature, meaning just for existing, there are certain rights that come along with that. And those rights include the right to free speech, the right to free practice of your religion, and indeed, the third thing that government has to protect, your right to property. And this is your ability to use your labor in creative, wonderful ways, and to benefit your neighbors by doing so, and to alienate that labor, to trade that labor for other people's labor. It's the government's job to protect these three things, all because these are extensions of you as a unique individual. As a human being made in the image of God with unique value as a human being, you have these three things that no one can take away from you: life, liberty, property. And we create government specifically in order to protect these. Now, in order for the government to do that, the government has to stop itself from violating life, liberty, and property. It's not just their job to ensure that other private actors leave you alone. The founders were very intent on preventing government from overstepping its own boundaries and then invading your life and your liberty and your property. And this is why the founders made very clear in the Declaration of Independence that any government that oversteps those boundaries loses its legitimacy, and there is a real rationale for overthrowing such a government. Any government that actually becomes the great invader of rights loses the consent of the people and thereby its legitimacy. Well, in a world in which we live free lives, but the true threat to our liberties doesn't come from other individuals, it comes instead from government, politics these days ought to be removing governmental barriers to your exercise of liberty, while of course maintaining a government that can fulfill that basic mission. But that's not what politicians on every side promise you. On every side, Republicans, Democrats, folks in the center, they all promise you the same thing. The thing they promise you is that if you have a problem, they can fix your problem. When they say the government can fix your problems, they're not talking about the problem of somebody killing you. Because we all agree the government should stop people from killing each other. Right? They're not talking about the problem of somebody invading your house and stealing your property. Everybody agrees that the government should stop people from stealing your property. And we generally agree that the government should not get in the way of you signing a contract to work at a certain place or trade one good or product for another good or product. What they are really talking about is the government alleviating problems in your life that are not the result of other people harming you. Right? You have a problem in your life, and it's not the result of someone stealing from you or hurting you or doing anything bad to you. It's just a problem in your life. And therefore, the government is going to come in, and it's going to fix it for you. This is the pitch that folks on all sides make. Today's politics basically breaks down into three versions of this argument. Two are from the left, and one is from the right. Okay, the first version of this argument is the intersectional argument. This is the one we hear most often on college campuses. And the argument goes something like this. Historic discrimination means that there is inequality. That inequality means that it is government's job to rectify those past ills through newfound discrimination. By violating individual rights, we can rectify the inequalities of the past. Now, this comes along with some pretty ugly rhetoric and some pretty ugly philosophy. The idea here is that we can determine whether you get to speak on politics or whether your group should be targeted by the government based on historical injustice or current inequality. What this means is that certain groups outweigh other groups when it comes to who we should listen to about politics. If your group has been more victimized in the past, then we should listen more to your group, and your group should get certain benefits from the government in order to fix that inequality that previously existed. And so there's a hierarchy of groups that exists on college campuses in terms of who we're supposed to listen to. It exists in politics in terms of which groups government programs are supposed to benefit. And the hierarchy goes something like this. At the very top, the folks who are discriminated against most, supposedly, and the people who we therefore have to use government in order to help. Right? These would be the LGBT folks. And then after that, it would be black folks. Then it would be Hispanic folks. Then it would be women. Then it would be Asians. Then it would be Jews. Then it would be white males. Right? That would be the hierarchy of intersectional groups. And if you rank low on this particular hierarchy, that's because you rank high on the so-called power hierarchy. And because you rank high on the power hierarchy, we should not listen to you. You should not have a role in determining how government is done. Because after all, your current privileged status is a result of past discrimination and past evil. And the government can fix that for you. The government can fix all of these things for you. This is where the check your privilege arguments come from. You say, listen, the policy you're espousing is unfair. The policy you're espousing is discriminatory. It's cracking down on one group at the expense of another group. Right? That policy is just not good policy. Well, the response to that is you don't get to talk about that because you are a beneficiary of the system that previously existed. Shut up. Okay, this makes for not only a bad politics, but also it makes for bad policy itself. Because it turns out the government is not actually capable of rectifying every imbalance. See, the intersectional argument is an argument that states too much. It says that every inequality that exists all across American society is the result of this history of inequity. Every inequality, every disparity is discrimination. Every time you look at a poor black guy, it is the fault of a rich white guy. Every time you see one group that is disproportionately imprisoned, that is the result of another group that is disproportionately imprisoning. Every time there is some sort of imbalance, that is an imbalance that is due to racism, bigotry, sexism, homophobia of some sort. But that's not true in a free country. It is true that there are after effects to historic discrimination. Of course, that's true. And those after effects have impact on the amount of wealth that certain people have in certain groups. But in a free country in which discrimination is not currently practiced, levels of mobility are not, in fact, dependent on your race. They're not dependent on your group identity. And to discriminate against one group at the expense of another group is to forward discrimination, make discrimination worse. Worst, what happens here is that this leads to crackdowns on actual fundamental rights. So you'll see this argument that is expressed, it was expressed in the New York Times recently, that freedom of speech is being weaponized, that freedom of speech is in and of itself discriminatory, because freedom of speech has created the hierarchy under which we live, the hierarchy has created inequality, therefore freedom of speech is a bad thing. Freedom of speech has actually undermined the quest for equality. You see this with regard to the argument against capitalist economics on behalf of intersectional theorists. What they say is capitalism, freedom, has created inequalities because it is reinforcing a hierarchy, and therefore, if we just get rid of capitalism, then we can get rid of the inequality. Not only is that bad policy, it also involves exactly the sort of invasion of individual rights that the government was created not to do. The government also happens to be really bad at rectifying these imbalances. So whenever the government tries to rectify these imbalances, it tends to make the imbalances even worse in a wide variety of ways. To take a quick example, President Obama, late in his administration, issued a ruling from the executive branch that said that all private contractors with the federal government would no longer be able to look at the criminal records of people who are applying for jobs. What this was designed to do was to increase the number of black people who are employed, because what Obama thought was that statistically there are a larger number of black folks with criminal records. We want to make sure they're employed, so we'll make sure that employers can no longer look at criminal records. What ended up happening is employers instead started using group data. They started looking at black folks and assuming that they were criminals, which is wrong and should not be done, because they could no longer check criminal records. Criminal records allow you to check individuals. The same thing is true with affirmative action. And when it comes to affirmative action, the argument is that black folks in the United States have been historically discriminated against. Therefore, we should set up a system to rectify that imbalance by allowing folks who have lower scores on their SATs or people with worse GPAs to get into particular colleges. The problem is affirmative action actually creates a dropout effect among a lot of black folks who are getting in through affirmative action. Dropout rates of folks who get into particular colleges through affirmative action much higher than the average dropout rate of people who get into that same college without affirmative action. Because it turns out that most people through SATs and GPA are going to precisely the college they should probably be going to in the first place. And by the way, where you go to college is not a final determinant of how you do in life. There are plenty of people who go to Harvard who are failures, and there are plenty of people who go to community college who do just fine. Okay, the second group of folks who make a promise to you that government can solve all your problems. These would be the so-called positive rights advocates. Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Right, their argument is essentially that government's job is not to protect God-given rights, but that government is the source of all rights. Government is the source of everything good in your life. You didn't build that. Right? The government's job is to protect stuff that we wish we had in a fairer world. It's the government's job to ensure fairness. Now, intersectionality posits fairness between racial and ethnic and sexual orientation groups. The positive rights argument, the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders argument, says that everybody should finish up in the same place just as individuals. And the only way to do that is to see the government as the source of rights. So for those of us who are what we call negative rights advocates, who believe that the only rights that you actually have in a state of nature are rights from other people, meaning that I have a right for you not to kill me, I have a right for you not to steal my property, I have a right against you that you're not allowed to invade my freedom of speech, right? These are negative rights that the government is supposed to protect because they're rights that exist in the absence of you harming me. The left believes in positive rights, right, which says that right to housing, right to health care, right to education, right to all sorts of things in which they get to point a gun at somebody and force that person to provide something for you. Right? The negative rights argument operates in a world of what they call in economics Pareto efficiency. In other words, we are seeking a system in which everyone is better off without making anyone worse off. But that's not the world of the positive rights argument. The positive rights argument operates in a world of redistributive justice. Right? This is the slogan you're going to hear from all your professors about social justice. Right? We have to seek social justice. So this is the idea of redistributive justice is pushed by philosophers like John Rawls, who you'll hear from if you take a philosophy or poli-sci course here, I'm sure. And his basic concept is that true justice can only be achieved when all inequalities that you are born into or experience throughout your life are gotten rid of. That we have to level the final outcome of any particular situation. This is why Bernie Sanders, who is an advocate of this, spends all of his time talking about inequalities in society, right? Because we all agree that inequalities exist, but then he says that the fact that an inequality exists means the government ought to do something about it. Why are so many people wealthy in this country when so few people have health care? Right? The idea that he's saying there is that the country is only just if you force some people to pay the bills of other people. Now, the positive rights argument places obligations on others that they don't actually have in a world of negative rights. So when people say there's a right to health care, sounds really nice. It means that health care is going to be provided, right? Well, not unless you're actually willing, in the end, to point a gun at a doctor and force that doctor to provide care at a price of your choosing. Because if there's any opt-out, then you don't have a right to health care. If you have to force people to do this. The same thing is true with regard to the so-called duty to serve at bakeries, for example. You've seen the left say that I have a duty to serve you. You walk in my bakery, I have to serve you, violating my own religious precepts in the process because I have a right to your services. You don't have a right to my services. But according to the positive rights advocates, you do. And this is supposed to fix all of your problems. Okay, none of this actually fixes everybody's problems because here is the problem with this. Okay, the essence of positive rights is force. The essence of civil society and social fabric is voluntarism. You want a happy, thriving society? You allow people to do what they want. You want an upset, angry society? You force people to do what you want. The positive rights argument forces people to do the things you want at their expense. Their individual rights become less important than your desire for crap. Okay, you don't get to do that in a free and open society. So when politicians promise you they're going to provide you a right to health care, understand they can only do that by forcing somebody else to do something that they do not want to do. Furthermore, force tends to erode the entrepreneurial spirit and to achieve the opposite of its intended effect. Because if you believe there's a right to something, it turns out that forcing people to do it means less of it. Right? When you force people to do things, they don't want to do it anymore. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez today, for example, she was railing against Amazon moving into Queens. And she was doing it on one basis that was actually rather solid, which is crony capitalism is bad, governments shouldn't be paying off corporations to move into their areas. That's correct. She's correct about that. And then she was doing it on a basis that was not solid, which she was saying it was going to force up the price of rent. Well, the reason it was going to force up the price of rent is because people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez believe that everyone has a right to housing. And the way they then establish that right to housing is by trying to force corporations to pay for the housing. Corporations don't want to pay for the housing, so they leave. So no one pays for the housing. And then they say, well, there's not enough housing, so what we really ought to do is rent control. We ought to force people to rent out at a price that we want a piece of property to you. Except what happens then is that no one builds any new properties, because if you can't make a profit on a new property, why the hell would you build it in the first place? So the actual policy that was intended to make things more just and more equitably distributed ends up with fewer units of housing and fewer people with actual housing. The positive rights argument ends up with less of everything unless you are willing to tax a bunch of people at exorbitant rates and violate their rights in doing so. Finally, we reach the third version of the government can solve everything for you argument. And this is the argument that you sometimes see in the Republican Party. And it predates President Trump, although President Trump engages in it. It goes all the way back to compassionate conservatism. Right? This idea that government can solve all social problems if it just sort of meddles around the edges. If government just sort of involves itself in a few key ways, then we can fix all of your problems. This is the do-gooder argument. So the argument here is a little bit different, kind of in the same vein as the positive rights argument, but the main argument is that strong families and social fabric cannot exist without governmental intervention. Right? This is the argument that President Trump sometimes makes. He says there are dying areas in the United States. If we don't provide jobs for dying small towns with dying industries, then the family is going to collapse there, and then those communities collapse, and then you can't have a functioning social fabric, so government has to step in and do something about it. Now, it is true that you need families and functioning social institutions in order to have a social fabric. But if you believe that families collapse because industries die, then I urge you to talk to humans. Okay, families have collapsed in the United States not because of lack of jobs. Lack of jobs has actually followed lack of families. It's the other way around. People don't get married for the tax break. And this leads to policies like the idea that we're going to give an earned income tax credit for a child tax credit for people who have a kid. And there's not a person in America or world history who has ever had a child just for the tax credit. That's not the way this works. Nor do people get married because tax credits are available. The same thing is true when we talk about communities in which politicians promise they're going to bring back jobs that have fled, right? All we have to do is put a tariff here or a tariff there or a subsidy here or a subsidy there. All we have to do is ban a new technology, and suddenly all the jobs will return. Well, this obviously undercuts the individual freedom, property ownership, right to alienate labor that we talked about right at the top. Now, it is true that all of the measures that I'm talking about can help a certain small group of people at the expense of an enormous, broader group of people. This is true for tariffs particularly, but it's also true of laws that would reduce technological innovation. I talked to Tucker Carlson recently on my program, and Tucker actually made the overt case that he would ban automatic driving in order to save truck driver jobs, which is essentially being a Luddite. Right? For those of you who recall your high school history days, the Luddites were a group of folks in the 19th century who actually went around smashing machines in order to save jobs in industries that were threatened by the presence of these machines. It is true, you can save jobs in that industry that way. You can also radically increase the price of doing business for everybody else who is doing that sort of business, make them non-competitive on the global stage, and make consumers pay more at the other end. And turns out those consumers also have families. Turns out those families also need jobs. And those businesses also need to thrive. You can't take from one person and give to the other and then suggest that you're making everybody better off, because you are not, in fact, making everybody better off. All of these attempts to strengthen families, strengthen churches by getting the government involved, right, they actually undercut individual freedom, and they bring us closer to that positive rights regime in which you are guaranteed a job. You know what you're really guaranteed in the United States when it comes to economic opportunity? You are guaranteed an adventure. You are guaranteed an opportunity, but you have to make the right choices. So what exactly can government do? What government can do is get the hell out of the way. Right? This is the conservative case. The government can remove barriers to success. Useless, counterproductive regulations. The government can stop, politicians can stop polarizing us on the basis of group identity for political gain. The government can create educational programs that don't suck as much as the ones that currently exist. We can stop the crony capitalism that benefits large corporations at the expense of small ones, which is what we're actually seeing with Amazon in Crystal City and New York City now. But what we cannot do is pretend that government is a cure-all. When a politician says to you that government's going to fix your problem, politician's lying to you. Government is the problem. You, the individual, are the cure.